The prelude to battle. The year was 624 CE, and the Arabian Peninsula was a land divided by tribes, each with its own customs, beliefs, and ambitions. However, a powerful force was rising in the midst of it all: Islam, brought forth by Prophet Muhammad, PBU, who had united many of the tribes under the banner of belief in the one true God, Allah. But as the faith spread, so did opposition. For years, the Quraysh of Makkah had been a fierce adversary to the message of Islam. They saw it as a threat to their power, wealth, and influence. The growing numbers of Muslims, many of whom were now settled in Medina, stood as a symbol of hope for the oppressed and a challenge to the established order. But the Quraysh were not going to let this challenge go unopposed. The Muslims, under the leadership of Prophet Muhammad PBUH, had recently made Medina their home. But the Quraysh were determined to crush the movement. To them, the Muslims were not just a religious threat, they were an economic threat as well. The caravan trade, a vital source of wealth for the Quraysh, was now at risk of being disrupted by the Muslims. And so the Quraysh had made it their mission to destroy the rising force of Islam, to protect their trade routes, and to maintain their authority. News came to Prophet Muhammad PBU that the Quraysh were sending a large caravan led by Abu Sufyan, one of their most powerful leaders. The caravan was carrying goods worth a significant fortune, goods that the Muslims could use to support their growing community. It seemed like an opportunity to strike a blow against the Quraysh and weaken their grip on the region. But Prophet Muhammad PBUH and his followers were not just interested in raiding the caravan. The battle was not just about wealth. It was about faith, freedom, and the survival of their belief in the one true God. For the Muslims, the conflict was about the defense of Islam and the pursuit of justice, not just material gain. As the Muslims gathered to face the Quraysh, tensions were high. The Quraysh had underestimated the Muslims, dismissing them as a mere band of refugees. They did not believe that a group of men, many of whom had no formal training in battle, could stand up to their powerful forces. But the Muslims were united by faith and a deep conviction in their cause. They knew that this battle would not just determine their fate, it would set the course of history. The Muslims marched towards the plains of Badr, a strategic location between Mecca and Medina, where they would face the Quraysh in what would become one of the most significant battles in Islamic history. Along the way, Prophet Muhammad PBUH led his companions with wisdom and patience. He did not seek war, but he was prepared for it if it came. His calm demeanor and trust in Allah were a source of strength for the Muslims, who had faith in their leader and in the justice of their cause. The Quraysh, on the other hand, had gathered a large army, more than 3 times the size of the Muslim forces. They were confident in their strength, but they underestimated the determination and faith of the Muslims. Their army was filled with some of the most powerful warriors of Makkah, including many of the leaders of the Quraysh, who had come to prove their superiority and crush the rising faith of Islam. As the two armies approached the battlefield, the stakes were higher than ever. The Muslims were fighting not just for survival, but for their faith, their families, and their future. The Quraysh, on the other hand, were fighting to maintain their dominance, to preserve their wealth and power, and to crush the Islamic movement once and for all. Prophet Muhammad PBUH and his companions prayed fervently, seeking Allah's guidance and mercy. They knew that they were outnumbered, but they also knew that Allah was with them. Their hearts were filled with determination and hope, knowing that they were fighting for something greater than themselves. And so the stage was set. The Battle of Badr would be a decisive moment in the history of Islam, a moment that would change the course of the world forever. Clash of armies. The morning of the battle dawned clear and bright over the plains of Badr. The Muslim army stood ready in their positions, a sense of unity and purpose in their hearts. They were vastly outnumbered, but their trust in Allah was unwavering. They knew that their strength did not come from their numbers, but from their faith. Prophet Muhammad PBUH, ever calm and composed, gave his final instructions to his companions, preparing them for what was to come. The Quraysh army, on the other hand, was filled with overconfidence. They were led by the most powerful men of Makkah, including Abu Jahl, one of the most ardent enemies of Islam. Their army had the best armor, the finest horses, and experienced warriors who had fought in many battles. They believed that victory was inevitable, and that the Muslims were no match for their superior strength. The Quraysh leaders mocked the Muslims, underestimating their determination and the power of their faith. As the two armies faced each other across the battlefield, a silence fell. The sound of the wind and the clattering of armor were the only noises that could be heard. Prophet Muhammad PBUH raised his hands in supplication, asking Allah for strength and guidance. The Muslims followed his example, praying fervently for victory, knowing that they were fighting not just for their lives but for the future of Islam. The first move came from the Quraysh. They sent their cavalry forward, hoping to break the Muslim ranks with a quick attack. But the Muslims stood firm, their lines unbroken. The battle had begun, and the sound of clashing swords and shields filled the air. The two armies met in a thunderous crash, and the fight became a desperate struggle for survival. In the midst of the chaos, the Muslims proved their mettle. Men like Ali ibn Abi Talib, the cousin of Prophet Muhammad PBUH, and Hamza ibn Abd al-Muttalib, the uncle of the Prophet, fought with unparalleled bravery. Their strength and valor inspired the rest of the Muslim army. The Quraysh, though strong, found themselves unable to break the Muslim defense. The tide of battle began to shift, and the Quraysh's confidence began to waver. Prophet Muhammad PBUH moved among his troops, encouraging them and offering words of support. His presence was a beacon of hope for the Muslims, and his belief in Allah's promise of victory kept their spirits high. Every Muslim on the battlefield fought with everything they had, determined not to let their faith and their cause be crushed by the forces of disbelief. As the battle raged on, the Muslims began to gain the upper hand. The Quraysh, who had once believed they would easily crush the Muslims, began to falter. Their leaders, including Abu Jahl, were struck down one by one. The loss of their leaders sent shockwaves through the Quraysh army, and confusion spread among their ranks. The once proud warriors of Makkah now found themselves retreating in disarray. The Muslims pursued their enemies with relentless determination, but Prophet Muhammad PBUH ordered them to stop. He reminded them that their victory was not a result of their own strength, but a gift from Allah. The Quraysh, now on the back foot, tried to regroup, but it was too late. The momentum had shifted, and the Muslims were on the path to victory. The Quraysh, realizing they had been decisively defeated, began to retreat, abandoning the battlefield. The Muslims stood victorious, but they did not celebrate. They knew that this victory was a sign of Allah's support, and they understood the responsibility that came with it. The battle had been a test of faith, and the Muslims had passed with flying colors. The victory at Badr was not just a military triumph. It was a spiritual one. After the battle, Prophet Muhammad PBUH and his companions took stock of the situation. The Muslims had suffered some casualties, but they had also captured several prisoners, many of whom were key leaders of the Quraysh. These prisoners would later be treated with dignity and respect, reflecting the values of Islam even in times of war. The victory at Badr sent a powerful message to both the Muslims and their enemies. It proved that faith in Allah, courage in the face of overwhelming odds, and unity among believers could overcome even the most powerful of forces. The Quraysh were forced to confront the reality that the Muslims were not to be underestimated. They had failed to destroy the Islamic movement, and their loss at Badr would forever alter the course of the conflict. The Muslims, meanwhile, had been given a great victory, but they knew that their struggle was far from over. The battle was a turning point, but it was only one chapter in a much larger story of faith, struggle, and triumph. And so, with the battle won and their faith strengthened, the Muslims returned to Medina. The victory at Badr was celebrated as a triumph of belief over disbelief, a moment in history that would forever be remembered by generations to come. But the Muslims also understood the lessons of the battle, that victory came through faith, courage, and reliance on Allah, and that every victory came with the responsibility to uphold the values of Islam in the face of future challenges. The aftermath and reflection. The victory at Badr was a momentous occasion for the Muslims, a turning point in their journey and a sign of Allah's favor. But as the celebrations began in Medina, the Muslims were not blinded by their triumph. They knew that the battle was just one step in a larger struggle, and the challenges ahead would require more than just courage on the battlefield. It would take wisdom, patience, and unwavering faith in Allah's guidance to continue the journey. The Muslims had emerged victorious, but the victory at Badr came with a price. Although the loss of life on the Muslim side was relatively small, compared to the Quraysh, the significance of the battle was not just in the number of casualties, but they had also captured several prisoners, many of whom were key leaders of the Quraysh. These prisoners would later be treated with dignity and respect, reflecting the values of Islam even in times of war. The victory at Badr sent a powerful message to both the Muslims and their enemies. It proved that faith in Allah, courage in the face of overwhelming odds, and unity among believers could overcome even the most powerful of forces. The Quraysh were forced to confront the reality that the Muslims were not to be underestimated. They had failed to destroy the Islamic movement, and their loss at Badr would forever alter the course of the conflict. The Muslims, meanwhile, had been given a great victory, but they knew that their struggle was far from over. The battle was a turning point, but it was only one chapter in a much larger story of faith, struggle, and triumph. And so, with the battle won and their faith strengthened, the Muslims returned to Medina. The victory at Badr was celebrated as a triumph of belief over disbelief, a moment in history that would forever be remembered by generations to come. But the Muslims also understood the lessons of the battle, that victory came through faith, courage, and reliance on Allah, and that every victory came with the responsibility to uphold the values of Islam in the face of future challenges. Aftermath and reflection. The victory at Badr was a momentous occasion for the Muslims, a turning point in their journey and a sign of Allah's favor. But as the celebrations began in Medina, the Muslims were not blinded by their triumph. They knew that the battle was just one step in a larger struggle, and the challenges ahead would require more than just courage on the battlefield. It would take wisdom, patience, and unwavering faith in Allah's guidance to continue the journey. The Muslims had emerged victorious, but the victory at Badr came with a price. Although the loss of life on the Muslim side was relatively small compared to the Quraysh, the significance of the battle was not just in the number of casualties, but in the message it sent. The Quraysh had suffered a heavy defeat, and their pride had been shattered. But for the Muslims, the victory was a spiritual one, a moment where their faith had been tested and proven true. Prophet Muhammad (MBUH), as always, emphasized the importance of humility. He reminded the Muslims that their victory was not because of their strength or their battle tactics, but because of the mercy and help of Allah. The Muslims had acted as instruments of divine will, and it was Allah alone who had brought them success. This reminder kept the hearts of the believers humble, even in the face of their newfound strength. The Quraysh, though defeated, were not willing to concede defeat. Their pride and their desire to maintain control over the region could not be so easily crushed. The loss at Badr had deeply wounded them, and it was a blow to their confidence and authority. However, it also ignited a sense of rage and vengeance. The leaders of the Quraysh began to plan their revenge, vowing to strike back with greater force and ensure that the Muslims would never rise again. One of the most significant outcomes of the Battle of Badr was the shift in the balance of power. For the first time, the Muslims were no longer seen as a small, oppressed group. They had proven themselves as a formidable force, capable of defending their faith and their way of life. The victory at Badr sent a clear message to both the Muslim community and the surrounding tribes. The Muslims were not to be underestimated. The defeat of the Quraysh also had an impact on the relationships between the Muslims and other tribes. In Arabia, some tribes that had been neutral or hostile to Islam began to reconsider their positions. Many of them saw the Muslims as a growing force that could not be easily defeated, and they began to seek alliances with Prophet Muhammad PBUH and his followers. Others, however, saw the victory as a challenge to their own power and authority, and they hardened their stance against the Muslims, preparing for further conflict. For the Muslims, the aftermath of Badr was a time of reflection and prayer. Prophet Muhammad PBUH and his companions took the time to thank Allah for the victory, but they also knew that their mission was far from over. The Quraysh were not going to give up easily, and the road ahead would be filled with new challenges. The Muslims understood that they could not afford to be complacent, and they prepared themselves for the next stage in their struggle. The prisoners of war taken from the Quraysh were treated with dignity, a reflection of the Islamic values of mercy and justice. While some were ransomed back to their families, others were kept in Medina to help the Muslims, and their treatment showed the contrast between the actions of the Muslims and the cruelty often shown by their enemies. Prophet Muhammad PBU emphasized the importance of justice, even in times of war, and the way the Muslims handled the prisoners became an example of the humane treatment they were known for. The victory at Badr also served as a catalyst for the development of the Muslim community. The Muslims knew that their success was not just in battle, but in their ability to maintain unity, discipline, and faith in the face of adversity. The event was a reminder that they were part of a greater cause, one that was guided by the teachings of Islam and the leadership of Prophet Muhammad PBUH. As a result, the bonds of brotherhood among the Muslims grew stronger, and the spirit of cooperation and support among them reached new heights. However, despite the outward calm in Medina, Prophet Muhammad PBUH and his companions knew that the Quraysh would not let their defeat go unchallenged. The Quraysh leaders began to rally their forces once again, vowing to avenge the loss at Badr and to crush the Muslim community once and for all. They would not let a group of believers destroy their authority, and they began to gather resources for the next battle. This period of reflection after Badr marked a critical point in the history of the Muslims. They had faced the Quraysh and emerged victorious, but they knew that they had to remain vigilant. The battle had proven their strength and unity, but it also reminded them of the importance of relying on Allah and remaining humble. The victory was not the end of their struggle. It was just the beginning of a new chapter in their fight for justice and faith. As the Muslims continued to rebuild and strengthen their position in Medina, they also prepared for what was to come. The Quraysh would soon make their move, and the Muslims would have to face them once again. But they were ready, for their victory at Badr had taught them an invaluable lesson. With faith, unity, and trust in Allah, they could overcome any challenge. The return of the Quraysh. Victory at Badr had shaken the Quraysh to their core. The defeat was not just a military loss. It was a blow to their pride and their authority. The Quraysh leaders, now desperate to restore their honor, began to regroup. Abu Sufyan, who had led the caravan, was among those who vowed to avenge the defeat. He gathered the remaining leaders of the Quraysh and began making plans for a large-scale retaliation. Their mission was clear. They would march to Medina with a force strong enough to crush the Muslims and erase the stain of Badr from their reputation. Prophet Muhammad PBUH and his companions knew that the Quraysh would not forget their defeat so easily. They understood that the road ahead would be filled with challenges and that their enemies would not rest until they had avenged their loss. But the Muslims, strengthened by their faith and the lessons learned at Badr, were determined to defend their community, and their beliefs. The victory had emboldened them, but they also understood the importance of preparation and unity. As the Quraysh gathered their forces, the Muslims in Medina began to prepare for the inevitable clash. Prophet Muhammad PBUH called for a council to discuss their strategy. His leadership was as steady as ever, and he sought the opinions of his companions. The Muslims knew that they were outnumbered once again, but they trusted in the wisdom of their prophet and in the protection of Allah. The Quraysh, numbering around 3,000 men, began their march toward Medina. Their army was well equipped, and they had learned from their previous defeat. They were determined to make sure they would not underestimate the Muslims this time. The leaders of the Quraysh believed that they had the advantage, not just in numbers, but in their experience. As warriors, they were confident that they could crush the Muslims once and for all, and restore their dominance over the region. The news of the Quraysh's advance reached Medina, and the Muslims prepared themselves for battle. The situation was tense, but the Muslims remained united and steadfast in their resolve. Prophet Muhammad PBUH instructed his companions to remain calm and focused, knowing that they had Allah's support. The Muslims were reminded that they were not alone in their struggle and that victory could only come through faith, unity, and trust in Allah's plan. As the two armies prepared to meet once again, the Muslims took to the battlefield with the same courage and conviction that had seen them through Badr. They were still outnumbered, but they had grown stronger in their faith and in their unity. The Prophet PBUH reminded them that the battle was not just for survival, but for the sake of Islam and for the protection of their community. The Quraysh army reached the outskirts of Medina, and the stage was set for the next confrontation. But this time, the Muslims were better prepared. They had fortified their positions, and Prophet Muhammad PBUH had chosen a strategic location for the battle, ensuring that the Muslims could defend themselves as effectively as possible. The two armies now stood on opposite sides, each knowing that this battle would decide the future of the conflict. The Muslims gathered in prayer, seeking Allah's guidance and support. Prophet Muhammad PBUH led the prayer, and the atmosphere was filled with a sense of purpose and hope. The Muslims were no longer the underdogs of Badr. They had grown stronger in spirit and in their ability to fight for their faith. Their belief in Allah's help and their trust in their prophet had transformed them into a force to be reckoned with. The battle began with both sides exchanging arrows and skirmishes. The Quraysh, with their superior numbers and experienced warriors, pushed forward with the intention of breaking the Muslim lines. However, the Muslims held their ground, using their knowledge of the terrain and their unity to defend their position. The fight was intense, with both sides suffering casualties. Among the Muslims, some of the most valiant fighters stood out. Ali ibn Abi Talib, the cousin of Prophet Muhammad PBUH, fought fiercely, his sword cutting through the enemy ranks. Hamza ibn Abi al-Muttalib, the Prophet's uncle, was another hero of the battle, displaying unmatched bravery and strength. The courage of these men inspired the rest of the Muslim forces, and their unwavering resolve gave the army the strength to continue fighting despite the overwhelming odds. The battle raged on, but Allah's help came to the Muslims in unexpected ways. As the Quraysh pressed forward, a sudden storm arose, confusing and disorienting their ranks. The Muslims, who had prepared themselves spiritually and mentally, stood firm in the face of the storm, while the Quraysh were thrown into disarray. This moment of divine intervention became a turning point in the battle, as the Muslims seized the opportunity to push back their enemies. In the end, the Quraysh were forced to retreat, their morale broken and their forces scattered. The Muslims had once again proven that their strength lay not in their numbers, but in their faith. The victory was not only a military one, but a reaffirmation of the power of belief and unity. Prophet Muhammad PBUH and his companions, though exhausted, knew that this victory would be remembered as a decisive moment in the history of Islam. As the Muslims returned to Medina, they did so with humility, knowing that their success had come through Allah's mercy. Prophet Muhammad PBUH reminded them once again that their victory was not due to their strength alone, but because of their reliance on Allah and their commitment to the cause of Islam. The end.